Following Tokugawa Ieyasu's ultimate victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, fought on the 21st of October, 1600, the long era of Japanese civil war known as the Sengoku Jidai came to a close. The Tokugawa shogunate established control, once more forming a dual power structure alongside the emperor's court in Kyoto. And at long last, peace returned to Japan. That period of peace, lasting between 1600 and the early 1860s, was a time of intellectual ferment when Confucian learning and Chinese studies took off in Japan. But there was another thread in this tapestry of academic pursuits, one which emphasized Japanese culture and Japanese history, and which would eventually help inspire the ideals which would lead to the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century. This collection of intellectual pursuits is known as Kokugaku, or National Learning. And before the video really gets going, just so we are all on the same page, this is going to be a lot of intellectual history, so in terms of formatting, this video is going to be more along the lines of a traditional classroom-style PowerPoint or keynote type of thing. So, if you, like me, are interested in this subject, then feel free to put this on as something more along the lines of a podcast and go about your day. So, let's get started. Kokugaku emerged out of the Japanese intellectual scene which had been pushed by scholars like Ogyu Sorai to turn away from modern Chinese and Neo-Confucian studies and towards what they called ancient learning. The general aim of this pursuit of ancient learning was that, because Confucianism and the history of China were extremely old, corruptions and influences from outside forces like Buddhism had entered the texts which scholars utilized. This reduced the accuracy of the information learned and taught in Japanese academies, so Ogyu Sorai argued that if the original, uncorrupted meanings of these subjects was to be understood, one had to go back to the original texts and to the original language, that is to say, what we today would understand to be Old Chinese. Essentially, Japanese scholars began to engage in philology, the study of the structure and historical development of language primarily through textual means. This blended with works on Japanese history being researched and compiled by historians in Mito domain, works of history which copied the textual structure of Chinese historical writing. But because the shoguns came and went but only one imperial dynasty stayed in power in Japan, there was ultimately a shift in Mito historiography which emphasized the importance of the Japanese emperor. And all of this led to some Japanese scholars taking an interest in ancient Japanese history, ancient Japanese literature, and Japanese philology, and the result was Kokugaku. Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi, the 5th Tokugawa shogun, made it part of his policy to encourage this type of study, and through his benefaction and the benefaction of other Tokugawa and related clan members, such as the Tokugawa who ruled Mito domain, funding for academic projects were often secured, so for Kokugaku scholars, much of their money came from the samurai government. Their first area of interest and research was with ancient poetry, in part because this made up a great deal of the surviving literature from the ancient period, and what they found contained within those texts ultimately went a long way in destabilizing the mental framework through which many Japanese understood the world. One of the cultural linchpins of the Sinosphere is the prevalence of a dualist philosophy, epitomized perhaps by the image of the yin and yang, which is a description of opposing but interconnected forces. No light without the dark, no dark without the light, that sort of thing. One way that dualism was understood was in the contrast between the natural and the artificial, and their associated concepts of female and male energies. After about 700, roughly, the Japanese began to be strongly influenced by Chinese culture. Writing systems and literature became bilingual, written using either Chinese or Japanese, and bicanonical, because the influence of Chinese literature was such that knowledge of both it and Japanese literature, but primarily Chinese, was the mark of an educated individual in ancient and classical Japan. So, to briefly summarize several centuries of Japanese history up until about 1700 and the dawn of Kokugaku, Chinese influence increased several times over. So when Kokugaku scholars began to study what would become known as Old Japanese, and when they began to read the ancient indigenous literature, what stood out to them was the prevalence of nature and the emphasis on raw emotion, in contrast to what they realized was an emphasis on formalism in Chinese poetry. A Chinese poem about, say, a flower may very well contain a description of that flower, but it would also contain a long digression into what Japanese scholars seem to be, well, absolutely anything else. A Japanese poem about the same flower from the same period, though, was noticeably shorter, and it emphasized the fleeting beauty of that flower because, as a living thing, eventually its time passes and it dies. The end point, then, was that Japanese poetry did not seek to do anything like instruct along moral grounds. It simply emphasized the wonder present in nature. What this did was shake the foundations of the Japanese worldview. In 1728, Kada no Azumamaro, a Kokugaku scholar, requested permission to establish his own academy in Kyoto, urging that this was necessary because native Japanese studies were being overwhelmed by Confucian, Buddhist, Chinese, Korean, and Indian thought. Chinese terms and Confucian principles were common knowledge, household names even, but the wisdom of Japanese emperors of ages past were not common knowledge, and the people did not know their own heritage. Furthermore, although Confucianism did seem to work in Japan and it did seem to help the Tokugawa prop up their structures, it served Japan imperfectly because Confucianism was a Chinese system and Japan was Japan, not China. So this is where the concept of dualism comes back into play. A great deal of Kada's studies were focused on the Manyoshu, a collection of Japanese poetry compiled in 759, and in reading these poems, Kada argued forcefully that they were, quote, the natural expression of our ancient heritage. They are the voice of our divine land. Because these poems had an emphasis on the beauty of nature and because they were free of Chinese influence, or so they seemed to be, an argument began to be built which stated that, in this dualistic view of the world, Japan was the natural, spontaneous half, while China was the artificial, more rigid half. The same perspective applied to language. Japanese grammar appeared to be less strict than Chinese. Therefore, to Kokugaku scholars, it followed that Japanese was natural and it was feminine. Over the next few decades, this argument would be expanded and reworked until arguably reaching its final form with the work of the scholar Motoori Norinaga. Kada's academy attracted many students, including a man named Kamo Mabuchi, who opened his own academy in 1738 and actually lectured to members of the Tokugawa on matters related to ancient Japan. But in 1760, only 22 years after he opened his academy, he closed his doors and became a wandering academic, moving around Japan and making pilgrimages to locations sacred to the Shinto tradition. In doing this, he eventually attracted many students, including the son of a merchant born near the Ise Shrine, sacred to the imperial family and the sun goddess Amaterasu, named Motoori Norinaga. Building on the work of Kada no Azumamaro, in 1765 Kamo Mabuchi wrote his most important text, Kokuiko, or A Study of the Idea of Our Country, although it wasn't actually published until 1806. In that book, Kamo attacked the tradition of Chinese learning which was prevalent among the Japanese, especially among the samurai, and he argued that the history of China, held in such high regard by so many of these Japanese scholars, was nothing more than a sham, because in China, there was nothing but strife as dynasties rose and fell one after the other, as each gained the mandate of heaven and then lost it in turn. But in contrast, in his view, Japan had a pure, unbroken tradition of one dynasty ruling since the beginning of time. He contrasted Chinese structures and rationalism with what he felt were indigenous traditions of commitment and belief, and to him, this was the superior way to approach the world. From his point of view, the human mind can barely comprehend human affairs. So then, why should humans try to comprehend and rationalize the affairs of heaven and of the gods? His answer was that it is impossible to do so, so therefore, mankind must be willing to admit that they don't know, indeed cannot know these things, and be willing in turn to trust and accept. So for Kamo, faith was a greater tool than just mere reason. Indeed, it was superior to it. From this intellectual scene emerged Kamo's greatest student and the most well-known Kokugaku scholar, Motoori Norinaga. More than any other Kokugaku scholar, Motori's burning passion in life was literature and the study of ancient texts. He was, essentially, the proverbial bookworm, and he spent 3 decades of his life on a series of massive studies based around the Kojiki, the Record of Ancient Matters, which was first compiled in 712 and was Japan's first written work to recount the creation mythos of Japan, the origins of Japan's gods, and the commands given by the sun goddess Amaterasu to her divine descendants, the Japanese emperors, to watch over and protect Japan. So from this point of view, and here we see the influence of Kamo, attempting to fully understand and rationalize the world, as these Kokugaku scholars felt the Chinese did, was ultimately dishonest. And the same went for trying to control or discipline emotion. It simply was not possible. What this ultimately meant was that the ability to feel deep, raw emotions was a good trait, and women, who were often less formally educated than men and thus more in tune with this ability to feel raw emotion simply because it had not been stifled by rationalism and by education, were a better judge of character and of the world than men were. Returning to this notion of dualism, all of this eventually led to the belief among not only Motoori Norinaga but among many Kokugaku scholars in general, that the Japanese spirit was feminine in nature, and that this was ultimately more powerful than the masculine spirit which characterized Chinese civilization, because if one had female energy, one was ultimately backed by nature, because women could do what men could not. They could give the gift of life itself, just as Amaterasu would ultimately produce the imperial line, and the Japanese people. So there eventually developed, therefore, a close identification between everything that was wrong with Japan and the non-Japaneseness of other cultures. Not necessarily just of China, although China more often than not simply served as a shorthand way of identifying anything that was non-Japanese. So to rectify what was wrong with the country, because Confucianism served it imperfectly, external influences had to be purged, and the indigenous had to be returned to and embraced. By the time he died in 1801, Motoori was credited with having over 500 students in 40 different provinces. But by far, the greatest influence in terms of a single teacher was that exerted by Hirata Atsutane. Under the teachings of Hirata, Kokugaku expanded and became strongly associated with Shinto and began to become extremely political, which ultimately resulted in the revival of an ancient ideal called Matsurigoto, the union of worship and politics. Through Matsurigoto, the emperor was connected through his divine descent to the Japanese people. He served the gods of Japan, and in turn, the Japanese people shared his burdens. They were, all of them, connected to the divinities by virtue of simply being Japanese. Eventually, not right away, but eventually, what this did was take something that had been floating around in Kokugaku circles, that is, ethnic nativism, and ramp it up from, say, a 3 to an 8 or a 9. One perspective that this rise in ethnic nativism eventually developed was the view that the rest of the world was formed from the waste materials which did not go into the making of Japan. So what that eventually led to was the belief, especially prevalent among Hirata and his students, that because the rest of the world was made from material that was originally going to be part of the Japanese islands, but was not, and because the gods made the world and the gods were Japanese, it did not really matter all too much if other cultures and other peoples were more advanced than the Japanese in certain matters, because ultimately, that knowledge was Japanese itself. So from this point of view, of course the Europeans were far more advanced than the Japanese were in terms of medicine, because from the Japanese point of view, the Europeans were dirty, unhygienic people, therefore they became sick more often, so of course the gods had taken pity on them and blessed them with advanced medicine. The fact that this was returning to Japan in the 1800s was perfectly okay, because evidently the Japanese were going to have need of this knowledge pretty soon. Other advances in other countries only served to reinforce this point. For example, the Copernican revolution in astronomy, which correctly adjusted models of the solar system to place the sun at the center, not the Earth, caused these Kokugaku scholars to look at what was happening in European astronomy. And because the Japanese traced their descent to the sun goddess, well, there you go. The ancient Japanese texts were correct all along. The sun is the center of everything, and the Japanese descend from the sun. Therefore, they are above everybody else. So ultimately, any and all scholarship which emerged out of the Japanese islands was superior to anything else because everything ultimately stemmed from Japan. So all outside learning was just a corrupted form of something the Japanese themselves would have eventually come up with when the need arose. Hirata and his Kokugaku students, because of this emphasis on nativism, had a great deal of respect for Japanese farmers and Japanese peasants because they cultivated rice, and because Shinto priestesses conducted rituals at the Ise shrine which involved rice, and because the emperor ate polished white rice. This made those who grew said crop, that is, the farmers, the focus of much of this Kokugaku nativism. Literacy rates in 18th century Japan were among the highest in the world, and farmers regularly read almanacs and short agricultural treatises. So into this literature, Kokugaku scholars injected their own work, and it began to enter the minds of the general population, which eventually produced a veritable flood of both practical and pseudoscientific learning that was popular among village councils. From all of this, ironically first sponsored by the Tokugawa themselves, would emerge the Sonno Joi movement, which would culminate in a revolution and the downfall of the Tokugawa. From 1868 on, Japan would embark on a new course led by a new emperor, and the Meiji period would lay the foundations for Japanese nationhood, empire, and ultimately struggle and defeat in the Second World War.